Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unauthorized Disclosure. I'm one of your hosts, Rania, Khalek, and I'm joined by the show's other host, Kevin Gosztola. Hello, Kevin.
Hello.
And today we have a really great guest. We have Danny Haiphong. Danny is a contributing editor at Black Agenda Report, and he's also on the organizing committee of No Cold War. And so, first of all, welcome, Danny. We're really excited to have you on.
Hey,
Uh,
thanks everyone. Thanks for having me.
And I mean, the reason we want you to come on is because we wanted to spend the show talking about the foreign policy that we expect to see from our new grandpa in chief, Joe Biden, and 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 Slay Queen Kamala Harris, who are going to be in charge starting in January because they won the presidency after a long and grueling week. And everybody who is like excited that Donald Trump was defeated. I mean, I'm excited that I'm happy. I'm a little bit relieved that Donald Trump is not going to be president anymore. But we can't go back to brunch because, as we see with these new cabinet positions that are that Joe Biden is preparing to fill, we're going to have a really hawkish administration on foreign policy, and in many ways, they're going to kind of like revamp U.S. empire in a much more effective way, which liberals tend to do. So, Danny, what's your take on what this next administration means for the world? Will it be a change from what we saw the last 4 years? Will do you see like new conflicts emerging under this administration? What do you see happening?
Well, it's difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen, but I definitely believe that Joe Biden's election is really more of a consolidation of power, especially in the foreign policy establishment, than it is a supposedly sweeping change for the better. And uh, Joe Biden and everyone that he is hoping to have around him have definite plans to ensure that the military industrial complex is happy, that the endless wars that the US wages abroad continue, and that the military budget continues to grow. During the campaign, Joe Biden promised that the US military budget would have to be increased in some areas, mainly because technology, military technology, is really where the Biden administration wants to invest much focus. So I don't expect much to change in terms of the actual existing conditions of US foreign policy. How that foreign policy is conducted will definitely change because we know that under Joe Biden, we will see the United States once again embrace NATO. We will see the United States shift from a hostile tone of belligerency towards certain countries like China, etc., and instead adopt a more humanitarian interventionist approach, which is no less damaging to the world. We will see an escalation in the U.S. military's proxy wars abroad. We'll definitely see that all across Africa. We'll see it in the Middle East. And we'll also see a real carrot and stick game with China and Russia, where the United States will abandon all overtures towards so-called détente, which Trump never really worked toward anyway. But we'll see a complete abandonment of that. We'll see great power competition heightened, but we will see the United States and the Biden administration attempt to conduct that national security strategy in a manner that pleases uh, both Biden's corporate overseers as well as the military industrial complex equally, rather than Trump, who was more interested in brandishing his own means of conducting these kind of affairs without really regard to how the United States looks around the world and without any regard to the possible consequences of a uh, divided foreign policy. I think that's part of healing the nation that Biden talks about. It's about unifying the foreign policy establishment so that the national security strategy of the United States purrs more smoothly than it was under Trump.
Just because I think it's important for people on the left who may have disagreements about how Trump carried himself as far as U.S. foreign policy, could you further define what you think the last 4 years represent in terms of, I guess, foreign policy or the U.S. empire, if we wanted to put it in that term? analogy. We could say it that way. And maybe you want to get into some of the more specific things that have defined foreign policy for the United States in the last 5 to 10 years.
Right. I mean, I think the word really is decline, and the word is crisis that describes U.S. foreign policy over the last 10 years. And Donald Trump represented this crisis and represented this decline in its most naked form. And the biggest disagreements that the US foreign policy establishment had with Donald Trump was not the fact that Donald Trump was some sort of peace monger, that he was trying to actually undermine the foreign policy establishment. It was about the way he went about representing what the US military meant to the world. And so, Donald Trump gave lip service to removing troops, actually had plans to do this in Afghanistan and Syria, but was undermined every step of the way by the Pentagon and every step of the way by the Democrats and every step of the way from much of his own party. We we know that Donald Trump was an unmitigated disaster, so there's no real uh, holding the tongue when it comes to how U.S. foreign policy did not become less hawkish under Donald Trump. What we more so saw was how the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the national security state is what is in command. So, regardless of whether Donald Trump wanted détente with Russia or not, regardless of whether he wanted some certain changes in various areas of U.S. foreign policy, all we saw Trump succeed in was being more hawkish in the areas where he promised to be more hawkish against Iran, for example, by tightening sanctions multiple times over the course of his administration, towards China, really escalating this new Cold War, escalating the so-called pivot to Asia, moving naval anti-aircraft naval carriers armed with nuclear weapons to the South China Sea. So that is where Donald Trump succeeded, and that is where Donald Trump was viewed as presidential. We heard Van Jones, we heard Brian Williams in the corporate media shower Donald Trump with absolute love when he was loyal to the U.S. foreign policy establishment. But where he deviated around NATO, around Russia, that was a breaking point, and that was something that the CIA, the Pentagon, the national security state did not enjoy and they did not tolerate. So there was definitely this internecine conflict within the ruling class because there was a crisis over how to manage these affairs, because the United States over the past 10 years has been largely unsuccessful in being able to project its hegemony in a way that satisfies its corporate overseers, because what we see across the world is chaos, is poverty, and an inability really to take advantage, short of the military industrial complex, which is running away and winning, and they're very clear. The executives of Raytheon and Boeing, et cetera, they're very clear that they will win regardless of who is in the White House. But the entire economic situation, the entire uh, broad strategy of the national security state is largely one of chaos, and it doesn't really have a sound strategy over how it is going to maintain its dominance. So all we see is massive casualties, massive refugee crises. These kind of things do not really lend itself to legitimacy. And it is just as important for the United States to be hegemonic and to be dominant around the world as it is to also be legitimate and to have a certain kind of identity which allows it to maintain that hegemony. And that is where Donald Trump and the US foreign policy over the last 10 years represented a crisis and a real rupture in that stability.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's interesting. We saw yesterday that that one of Trump's advisors, who was a representative for the Middle East, Jim Jeffries, he's out of the Trump administration now, and he was bragging to the media that he was lying to Trump about the number of troops in Syria. I mean, Trump was terrible, but one thing that he did do, but he didn't care enough to actually do, was he had this sort of instinct towards pulling back US troops from certain countries. Well, he never did it, but he thought he did in Syria. And then it turns out that his own advisors and national security people were lying to him about that, telling him there was like 200 troops in Syria when we had several, like a couple thousand, or who knows how many. They don't actually tell us. But I think it points to the fact that there is this everyone thinks it's a right wing talking point, but there is this deep state that exists, this sort of national security state that functions and goes on and continues to do all the things that you just described, no matter who's in charge, right? Like, it's like if we had a president Bernie Sanders, would he even be able to change it? I don't think so.
No, I mean, no. The answer is definitely no, and that's the essential character of the United States is a military state. It is one that's dominated by not just these big military industrial complex giants, but the entire capitalist economic framework of the United States is predicated and built upon war. That's been the case since World War II. A lot of people say, oh, well, the US became hegemonic after World War II. And the reason why it was because the military industrial complex ended up becoming the sole and central focus for development. That's how the United States really got out of its Great Depression. I mean, we're in one right now, but the first Great Depression, the United States got out of it by heavy investments in military hardware and being able to export those abroad. And we see now that the United States, yeah, is completely dominated by these forces. And a President Bernie Sanders would have had to contend with these forces. And I conclude, and I would say that it would be remiss to negate the fact that Bernie Sanders' economic agenda necessarily means that the US military industrial complex would have to be curtailed. There would have to be a pullback, a real austerity regime put into place for the US military in a significant way, not the minor ways around certain things like veterans, like the VA or um, certain levels of replacing troops with tech, but a real austerity regime, pulling back bases, pulling back, these spheres of on these spheres of influence in order to invest in something like a universal healthcare model, like a universal education model, like forgiving student debt. There would have to be a lot of uh, disinvestment in the U.S. military in order to pull these things off. And so that's also what makes just the social democratic agenda in the United States so threatening to the U.S. military industrial complex. It's why they, despite the fact that Bernie Sanders at times tried his best to align with some aspects of the military industrial complex, some aspects of the war machine, it didn't matter. There was absolutely no support for him in that area. He was really seen as a malign target, as a socialist, a communist, to be compared to people like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. For me, that's fine, but for people in the national security state, for the intelligence apparatus, for the Pentagon, that is unacceptable. And so it's important to connect those two things together.
Have you been able to follow some of the individuals who have been floated as possibilities who will be staffing the Biden administration? And I'm wondering if you have anything to say. And obviously, it's largely speculative, but we do know who is advising Biden, and we can figure out the school of foreign policy that we're going to get. And we do know to some degree how linked in they are to many of the think tanks, and also their links to places that are funded by weapons manufacturers.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, yeah, I've been following it somewhat. It's quite troubling. It was not unsurprising to see who Biden is floating out there. These very dangerous characters. The two most dangerous that come to mind are Susan Rice and Michelle Flournoy. We know that Michelle Flournoy worked for years at the Boston Consulting Group, has been kind of this think tank, military contractor, lobbyist, writing very significant papers on U.S. military strategy and securing tens of millions of dollars in military contracts for her clients. And we also know during the Obama administration, when there was a pivot to Asia, that sent U.S. investment in the Asia Pacific militarily uh, to a degree that we had never seen before, to the point now where we have over 50% of all military assets stationed there. She was not satisfied with that strategy. She saw it as not fierce enough, not hawkish enough. And so that's what we can expect if Michelle Flournoy is nominated or given the Secretary of Defense post. And furthermore, Susan Rice. I mean, what is there to say about Susan Rice? We know Susan Rice, while she was working under the Obama administration in various positions in the national security state, she traveled to Libya and celebrated the coup and the NATO invasion there as a victory for human rights and democracy, despite the fact that the Obama administration had led through NATO the absolute destruction of the most prosperous African country at that time, and one that was rich in oil resources that had successfully nationalized them to meet the significant needs of its people. And so we also know that Susan Rice has been, since the Clinton administration, a key cog in the destruction of the Democratic Republic of Congo. She has millions of dead Congolese on her hands because she was a champion of Paul Kagame and his patriotic army. And so this is what we can expect when Biden finally names his team. It's these very uh, established careerists in the military industrial complex who have done everything that they can to satisfy the interests of their clients, and their clients being Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a very rocky road, but it will look very stable, because one thing that people in the NSA, the CIA, within the Pentagon, within the national security state as a whole, one thing that they do have going for them is they have years of experience this uh, in this field. They have years of experience on how to promote, how to engage, how to use the public relations arm of the state to promote this endless war agenda without having this kind of resistance that we would expect from such heinous and atrocious crimes.
Danny, would like to know one thing. Why do you hate successful women? No, I think the points you're making are very important because this is one of these places where liberals get super, and some progressives get super blinded by identity politics. If Michelle Flournoy becomes, which she's like the main person who likely will be chosen as Secretary of Defense, she'd be the first woman Secretary of Defense. You'll have probably Susan Rice as Secretary of State. Um, you've had several of those before, but everyone will be really excited about that. And you've got your first female vice president, Kamala Harris, who herself has demonstrated with her rhetoric and the policies she supported that she is a hawk as well. So it'll be interesting to see how the identity politics plays out in this administration versus during the Obama administration. But on top of that, I want to move to a different kind of aspect of all this, which is another girl boss, if you will. You've written a bit about her. I know about AOC. So the reason I bring her up is because what I see happening, and this is sort of more insider Democratic Party stuff, but what I see happening within the Democratic Party is this kind of public fight right now between this progressive wing of the AOC types versus the far more dominant establishment wing of the sort of like Biden, Harris, Flournoy, Rice, kind of types. And there does seem to be what I think, and maybe Kevin might disagree with me on this, there does seem to be this kind of delusion among progressives who consider themselves like the left base of the Democratic Party, that they can somehow move these people to the left through these like 4 or 5 members of Congress that support of their ideas through the squad, right? Like AOC and Ilhan Omar. My position on that you cannot. It's nice to have some decently progressive people in Congress, but there's like 5 of them in a sea of 400 right wingers. They have no power. And they're basically at this point just begging for little crumbs that they're not even getting. So what's your take on that? And then I'd also like to hear kind of Kevin's response to what I just said, because he is the more optimistic one among us. But I have a more pessimistic take. I just think it's like completely delusional to think you can keep building inside and try to change this party, which is what I see happening. Even after this election, even as Biden shits on the progressives and the whatever left, whatever that means, shits on them by literally saying, like, I won't even appoint Elizabeth Warren, who's like barely left, to any cabinet positions. I'm gonna appoint Republicans. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, in my opinion, the best thing that the squad or that Bernie Sanders could do would be to take their masses of supporters, which they have, and break from the Democratic Party completely. We know that's not going to happen because that would potentially be a career ending disaster for them, and that basically holds them back from doing that. There is, I think, an unspoken allure and just an objective fact that when you do succeed within the political machinery in the United States at any level, but especially in Congress, there is something to be protected, which is the career, which is your friendships, which is your connections. And regardless of their politics or what they think, they're quite well aware. They're not dumb people. They are quite well aware that there are sacrifices that come with that position. So it would be one thing if AOC and Elon Omar, if they were consistent in using their platform to kind of continue to break that stranglehold that the Democratic Party has over uh, more progressive minded people in this country. But what we see time and time and again, which I think is disturbing in some ways, but just expected in others, is that AOC and the like, they uh, consistently choose and pick which issues are the most important, and then they consistently choose issues which they find are necessary to align with the establishment over. And I think the question of war and peace is the biggest one, where they're either relatively silent, or in the case of Elon Omar, for example, you will have some resistance against the Trump administration around Venezuela, around sanctions, which is certainly to be supported. But then on every other issue, Syria, China, we see the same hawkish rhetoric coming out, which we know translates into real policy, because if they're not resisting the war machine, then the war machine is able to carry out its policies without a challenge. So, of course, it's not all on them. It really is dependent upon the movement that backs them. And if that movement is not prepared to make these kind of demands on those they support, like Elon Omar or AOC, then they're just not going to do it. But I think what we are seeing with the coronation of the squad, with their ability to maintain some semblance of a career in Congress, albeit a very new phenomenon, that the Democratic Party really can't be shifted left as an institution, regardless of how much of the left it can absorb. That institution is going to continue to have the same power structure. And people like AOC and the rest are who are aligned with her are going to be marginalized, regardless of how much they grow. They could grow two times, in the next several election cycles, but it still would not matter because they would still continue to be marginalized. And we know that their politics will continue to be compromised. And this, I think, is a lesson to the need for a real independent mass movement, for the need for a more militant politics, which speaks to a consistent vision and a consistent sort of framework for how we make demands on power, and then how we go out to people and articulate those demands so they come on board with us. I don't think that the electoral framework is really the way that's going to begin the process. I think this is really more of a sign that the Democratic Party, in and of itself, is having a really difficult time managing its own constituencies, more so than it is a reflection of what we really need to do on the ground here in the belly of the United States' empire.
Oh, I actually largely agree, though. What I want to add to this conversation is so by the time this is posted, there should be a report up at the Gray Zone because I've been looking very closely at the agency review teams that are coming in that are working on the Biden Harris transition. And I would say that if you believe that they can be pulled to the left, you should take a very close look at the people who are on these agency review teams, the people who are going to be setting the agenda for the first 100 days and beyond. Because to me, I think it confirms what Danny is saying, and I'm sure what Rania feels. It confirms that these are a group of people that are going to insulate a Biden administration from being pulled in any direction to the left. I mean, I question whether it would, in fact, even be liberal. It's pretty clear to me that it's going to be centrist and even perhaps neoconservative in the way that it's pursued, because they're going to be pursuing compromise and looking for ways to manage. I mean, I don't know how easy it will be to unravel some of what Trump has set into motion over the last 4 years if it, in fact, did depart from President Obama's administration. And so, if they do want to change it, this is actually how I feel about anything from foreign policy to domestic policy. This is my attitude that even if they made a pronouncement that they wanted to change, they are going to have to be very technocratic in the way that they go about making that change, to the degree that we may not even be able to notice it. It will probably be mostly cosmetic what they are able to do, because certain policies were already set in motion that are difficult to just reverse overnight. And so, to some degree, you become an owner of it, and it becomes part of what you do. This is what we saw with Barack Obama when he inherited a lot that President George W. Bush had done. He made these pledges to change it and reverse course, but then ultimately he became this technocrat who found a way to sell it to the public. And I think that to me, I think that's what we need to get into here, is the sophisticated nature in which the Democrats are able to sell a foreign policy that Donald Trump can't even make appealing to the mass population. And I don't know if they are successful in selling it, but certainly the thing that stands out to me when I put together a thread of all the individuals who are on these agency review teams and get the kind of reaction I do when people are viscerally angry or find these people to be detestable warmongers, can't believe that they're anywhere near Biden administration. My takeaway is that the one key difference between these people and the people who might staff a Republican Trump, or let's say if Trump would decide to run for office in 2024 and make a comeback, the difference between the people that he's having staff his administration and the staffers that go to populate a Democratic administration is that they believe they can do this all out in the open, that they are working very carefully to make their cutthroat and savage policy into one that they believe can fit into the law and be seen as something that is, as Danny's been pointing out, legitimate to the international world.
I mean, yeah, I completely agree with that. It's definitely a historic trend in the way in which the empire has been managing its affairs. It really, the biggest shifts we've seen in foreign policy is more so a question of how this is being done. It's not a question of whether things are going to get worse, because we have seen the empire attempt to expand and do its best to carry out the agenda of the national security state. And whatever the Pentagon puts on paper, whatever the CIA um, really sets its mind to, is really what successive administrations have carried forward. And it's all about the possibilities of the moment, more so than it is about some kind of political difference between someone like Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Those personal ideological differences, while significant in some cases on this question, ultimately are secondary to how the people that actually control them and influence them and push them and devise strategy for them, how they want things to be carried forward, which is why I do not see Joe Biden really being able to, even if he wanted to, roll back a lot of these policies. In the foreign policy realm, I know that there's some hope that China will be less of a target because a lot of the world economic order is hinged upon a more normalized situation between the two countries. But the best that I can see out of this situation is that Joe Biden just tampers down the rhetoric toward a country like China. But I don't believe that the great power competition and national security strategy that it has been put forth under Trump will change one bit. There have been several studies by the Rand Corporation. There has been so much work done on how to contain China, and that didn't begin with Trump. It didn't even begin with Obama, even though the Obama administration really did escalate it. It really began in 1949 when the United States saw that China was now quote unquote lost to communism. And ever since then, successive administrations have taken different approaches somewhat, but there's been a broad strategy of this, even if it is beneficial, this relationship, the country needs to be contained. And necessarily, that's going to mean eventually a military strategy. And there's always been a military strategy just on this question alone. So I think when it comes to how the US conducts its affairs abroad militarily, we will for sure see a cosmetic difference and change, but we will not see any sort of reduction in or scale back in the suffering. I think whatever suffering does get reduced, like let's say the Iran deal gets signed, we will see that suffering shifted elsewhere because ultimately the strategy is going to be the same. Countries like Syria, Iran, Venezuela, etc., they need to be overthrown, controlled. They need to be governed by a US centric agenda. And Joe Biden is completely on board with that. He may be, I believe his cabinet will likely be more hawkish than even a Barack Obama, who, at least, despite absorbing nearly all of the Bush administration's apparatchiks, he at least had to, at the given moment he was elected the first time, speak to some semblance of quote unquote dumb wars and ending them. Joe Biden has no such mandate.
And you know what I think is interesting too is that foreign policy really fallen on the back burner of what uh people domestically who claim to be on the left really seem to care about. And I think it's a huge mistake on several fronts. One of which is, um, our foreign policy is making, I think, global north more right wing. Every time we destroy a country and create these waves of refugees, it's literally changing the politics of North America and Europe. I mean, Donald Trump won his election by saying that, Muslims and ISIS and Mexicans and everyone's an evil terrorist rapist. Um, you've seen the politics of Europe shift towards more like right wing populism versus more and more centrism because when right wing populists seem to empower, the centrists really dig in their heels and push neoliberalism even harder. Uh, so it's like it's really frustrating to watch how no one seems to really care about foreign policy who's also saying they want things like Medicare for all. That's kind of a sweeping thing I'm saying, but I'm just saying generally speaking, uh, when these things are intricately connected. Like the more the US expands its empire, the more it decays from the inside, is incapable of providing anything for people at home.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is frustrating. I mean, it's been the biggest frustration for me with the insurgency, so to speak, that we've seen within the Democratic Party, where you have millions of mainly young people ready to kind of take the demands or at least the political orientation of an Occupy Wall Street, of a Black Lives Matter uprisings, and put that into some form of political uh, 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 framework and organization. But it was within the Democratic Party. And during the Obama years, one of the most damaging parts about the Obama administration was, as Kevin was saying before, the uh, effectiveness of moving the most progressive constituencies in the United States to the right, especially on this issue of foreign policy. I mean, we at Black Agenda Report talked about how during the so-called red line scandal, the Obama administration threatening potentially bombing Syria and really escalating a hot war on top of its proxy war, we saw that Black people in the United States, which happened to be the most anti-war constituency in the U.S. over the course of its history, uh, were actually in support of that war to a larger degree than white Americans were polling, and that was a first. And I don't think the impact of the Obama era has yet to dissipate. I think that the reason why foreign policy is not really on the agenda of the Sanders insurgency, its movement, is because there was this consolidation that occurred under the Obama period. There was this shift to the right, and there was this real pink washing and progressive washing of neoconservative, hawkish policies, and especially this humanitarian interventionist line, which we will see a return of. We already hear Joe Biden tweeting and talking about how he wants the United States back in the game and he wants human rights to be on the agenda again. And that's just a dog whistle for the impending humanitarian interventions, which the Biden administration will undoubtedly seek to employ wherever it happens to be most uh, expedient at the time. So I think that that's where we're headed. Is we're headed more towards this kind of human rights narrative, this Kenneth Roth, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International way of doing foreign policy, where the United States is seen as this arbiter of human rights and the arbiter of freedom and democracy around the world. And it's no longer going to be about, as Kevin again was saying, how the Trump administration is so brash and is so overt and is basically telling people over Twitter that he wants to stage a coup in Venezuela or overthrow Maduro or whatever it may be. So that I think is where we're headed and where the shift in foreign policy is going to mainly reside.
I'm actually curious, Kevin. I did see you did a thread on another one amazing thread. It reminded me of your DNC thread when there was the DNC committee, and you went like person by person. You did a really meticulous thread, meticulously documenting these people on Biden's transition team. And I'm curious what stood out to you and disturbed you the most. I think this is what you're gonna have your gray zone piece be on. But maybe give us a little taste.
Well, so generally speaking, what struck me is that I knew that this exists, but when you look at the roster of people who are on these agency review teams, you see so clearly the revolving door with the military-industrial complex. So these are people who, it's been noted, were staffers in the federal government during Obama's administration. They may have worked underneath people who were appointed to lead Obama's cabinet, but they have experience and they went to corporations to sell their experience and to profit off their experiences after the first or second term of the Obama administration. And then now they're returning with their corporate connections, with their consultancy backgrounds. They are returning to these agency review groups to fashion the first 100 days plus for a Biden administration to help him get on the ground running. And while I think that we might get a favorable policy when it comes to responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, although there are some things that are probably going to be detestable as far as how it caters to the interests of big pharmaceutical companies, what I think is alarming is how you look at these individuals, and they represent the way in which the Obama administration was able to normalize the assault on our civil liberties in a post 9/11 world. These are people who allowed barriers to collecting our own private information, as revealed by NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, the massive surveillance programs that are out there. These are people who have been connected to diminishing and discrediting whistleblowers like Snowden, two CIA whistleblowers, Jeffrey Sterling and John Kiriakou, who challenged torture, who are people who were were victims of the Obama administration's record number of leak prosecutions under the Espionage Act, which is now escalated into going after WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And we'll see if Joe Biden proceeds with this case, but I believe as a person who's inheriting the Assange case, that he's most likely going to allow it to continue. And I don't see people on his agency review teams that would take any issue with a Justice Department that goes forward with this. I noted that Neil McBride was someone who oversaw the WikiLeaks grand jury investigation and left in 2013, and he is, in fact, part of the Justice Department agency review team. But if you look at the wars aspect, I think a question that I'm going to ask for Danny after I wrap this up relates to Russia. But you look at Syria, and you see the presence of Dana Stroll, who was on the Syria study group, who spoke about how very, very openly. This is the thing that this basically makes my point. They're very open about what they're doing. Even Donald Trump was, but they're open in a way that they believe they're going to not have to defend it, in my view, because they think people are going to just accept it as the standard way of doing business. In some ways, she's got common cause with Donald Trump, because she talked about occupying 1/3 of Syria and controlling the resources in this part of Syria as a way of forcing regime change in the country. That it's not about fighting ISIS, but that she wanted to maintain a presence in order to create the kind of suffering that would force a political outcome in Syria. So when I see people like that, the kinds of characters that are connected to the military-industrial complex, I think you really have to wake up and say that it might not be all that different. I mean, it did stand out. When you looked at Trump's administration, you saw someone from Boeing who was invited on board to be the Secretary of Defense. It seemed like, let's just cut out the middlemen and let's just have the military-industrial complex actually just be there. Let's not have the representative. But then you look at this and you see people coming from think tanks, like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, or you see CSIS is one, or Center for a New American Security is another one, funded by weapons manufacturers. And you ultimately figure out that these think tank groups are just these basic conduits to the military-industrial complex that the liberal class can be representatives of, and then they go and fill these positions in the cabinet. And so to Danny, I raise, because we haven't gotten there yet, and it dominated the last 4 years, what your views are on a potential policy towards Russia, because I think this might be one of the most alarming aspects of the first term of a Biden administration, because we have Susan Rice on record in the last year hypothesizing that it could be the Russians who were behind George Floyd protests. We also know that Kamala Harris was suggesting that it could be the Russians behind Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the NFL protests that were entirely legitimate, and yet we know that we've spent the last 4 years seeing social media companies be empowered to conduct censorship campaigns against people on the basis that they are somehow super sleuths who can identify Russian disinformation campaigns, even though I'm not quite sure what their criteria is, and it seems to all depend on their ideology and the extent to which they support the U.S. empire. So what do you have to say about what an incoming Biden administration would be like for Russia?
Well, it's a disaster. I mean, sometimes you have to think in the last 4 years, you have to just, I don't know, wipe the funk out of your eyes and just pinch yourself a little, see if you've actually been sleeping through this period, because everything that you just mentioned, if you just do a monologue on that, it's quite horrifying just what's happened in the last 4 years under Trump, the way that the so-called quote unquote resistance, which really was just consortium of neocons, neoliberals within the national security establishment and its corporate overseers. That strategy, that orientation, that a real CIA narrative, right? We know that John Brennan was a big architect of the whole RussiaGate fiasco and phenomenon, thanks to the great work of people like Aaron Mate and yourself and others. Yeah, I in terms of Russia, we're in for a real shift in rhetoric because despite the fact that the United States did become more belligerent towards Russia during the Trump administration, there was at least a shift in a conflict in the thinking that Russia should Russia be a target of US military hostility and just US policy in general? And now, rather than this, what I think a lot of the left believed was Trump playing. I don't know if Trump is actually this keen and smart and strategic, but there was a lot of ideas that Trump was really trying to divide Russia from China. I don't think there's really any material basis for that. China-Russia relations are just as strong as they were, but there was an idea that maybe Trump was trying to get closer to Russia, so to play off China, to weaken China. Hard to say, but what we will see is a more unified policy in this regard. We will see the national security state escalate against Russia. It's been building up over the last 4 years ideologically. It's such an important thing to note that all of these policies, all of the censorship that we've experienced based on Russiagate, about gender poor, like people like yourselves, it's all about creating this notion of a Russian boogeyman and then censoring the voices that can counter it so that the operations, whether they're the covert operations of the intelligence apparatus or whether it is the US military encirclement of China, I mean, of Russia and China, but of Russia specifically, um, we're really in for, I think, a new phase in this Cold War return, in this new Cold War mentality that will include now Russia and China. Over the last 4 years, I think a lot of people, especially in the last two, have thought, oh, well, the United States is in some kind of big conflict with China, but Russia will return now into the fold. And I do believe that everything that you've mentioned will get worse too. The civil liberties, the censorship, American Herald Tribune, which I've published for dozens of times, has been taken down by the FBI. I have no idea why. I can't reach anybody over there. It's this kind of blatant censorship over social media, over the interwebs, Google, over the Silicon Valley tech corporations that really dominate our digital communications. That will tighten up as Joe Biden's administration seeks to consolidate its policy of scapegoating Russia and also achieving what is a real foreign policy objective, which is to ensure that Russia stays the country that it was after the fall of the Soviet Union, a completely dependent, impoverished, non influential country that can be dictated and controlled by international finance. The big reason that the United States has huge issues with Vladimir Putin and Russia as it stands now is because there's been a shift away from that kind of thinking that Russia should be independent and that it should have its own economic and foreign policy, etc. So, with that reality remaining under a Biden administration, that same effort to undermine Russia's influence around the world and to use Russia as a foil for any excuse to suppress alternative thought, independent thought, critical thought itself will get worse. And you have people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and all of the national security apparatus, which you named, to all come together in almost this perfect storm to make sure that Russia is just a huge target for the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and it's troubling. And I think that we're going to see a lot of very fierce, very hostile attempts to use this policy as a way to undermine anything and everything that could be deemed a threat to U.S. power domestically and abroad. And that, I think, should be heeded by anybody who has been paying attention to the last 4 years. But we know that the liberal class is completely on board with Russiagate, as they were with much of the Trump administration's foreign policy as well.
Can I ask you? Unfortunately, I don't have the title handy, but it came across that I saw that a book you contributed to was being censored by Amazon. Like Amazon won't let you won't let the group. I believe it was, is it the International Solidarity Action Center? And it's a book about COVID-19 and how China has been effective. And there's a lot of writers who contributed, who I think we've given a platform to on the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. But I was wondering if you could talk about, because I think what you're saying is important here, that it isn't just about combating Russia or even like fitting it within any sort of constructive U.S. foreign policy goal. It very clearly is, if it's going to give someone who's a competitor an edge, we're going to need to stamp out those views, those analyses, that kind of reporting that gives people an insight into what is happening, whether it's coming from Russia, China, it could be coming from the global South. It's a very real threat to, if it poses a legitimate threat to how the world views the United States, as we're seeing with the prosecution against Julian Assange. We need to make it harder for people to access that material so that they don't become awakened to certain realities.
Yeah, no. Well, the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, was edited by a friend of mine who actually organized the delegation I went to China, Suhin Lee. He edited the book. Sarah Flounders and the International Action Center published the book, and they're having a really hard time being able to distribute it on Amazon. They're facing a lot of pushback, and they've been unsuccessful. And so the the big idea with this kind of censorship, and I think this is kind of what we're going to see, is that whenever there is a primary U.S. foreign policy objective that's challenged in any sort of significant way by a group of people, by an individual, it's going to be flagged. We also have seen Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every single social media account and outlet uh, determine and label whichever accounts it wants as Russian affiliated media. I know Rania has been thrown into that label, but we see it with all of the media coming out of China, coming out of Russia, RT, CGTN, etc. And that this will all escalate under a Biden administration, because it is the preferred way for an agency like the CIA of doing things, right? This is the most effective way to forward US foreign policy and domestic policy objectives. This is the way you isolate voices and you intimidate people who are seeking the truth and trying to build platforms, build organizations, and build movements that can challenge the injustice, the inhumanity, and the oppression that comes about from these policies. So this is where I think that struggle, that class struggle, that real struggle over power comes into play, is when we see these kind of things happening. And for the book, and for, I think, just the rest of us who are trying to use these platforms for distributing material, it really begs the question of what kind of response are we going to mount? Because we haven't been able to mount a generally effective one, mostly because these institutions, these forces, have the means of communication at their disposal, and they have the tools, they have the resources, they have full U.S. government backing, and all of that means, as you also noted, Kevin, I think in your thread on this, there's a lot of um, lawyers as well from social media corporations. We have this, I think, complete interlocking relationship between social media, digital communication, corporate media as a whole, and the military industrial complex and the national security state as a whole, all working together to make these kind of things happen, to make the banning of certain material happen, to take down entire websites, to also just throttle as much work as possible from independent sources, whether it's domestic or abroad. So yeah, this is a real troubling time, and it's important for us to especially to start paying attention to it now if we haven't been paying attention to it before. If there are folks out there who were just so wrapped up in Trump mania and Trump hysteria and derangement syndrome, whatever it was, now is the time to kind of wake up. I don't know, pinch yourself a little bit and start to pay attention to voices who are stating this and sharing their work and helping kind of build our ability to cut through what is a real fierce assault and attack on everything that we are trying to do.
Well, sorry, no, we'll cut this out of the show. I think that this is a really good conversation, and I mean we covered a lot of ground in what we were tackling. So I don't have anything else to say other than let's put up Danny's Twitter so people can follow
where
him.
Can people follow
and
also, where can people follow your work in general? Like, where can they find you?
Sure. So each week you can find a column at Black Agenda Report at www.blackagendareport.com. Monthly, we do our own YouTube program, The Left Lens, which you can find on YouTube. And you can also subscribe to my Patreon, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I think, as we say with every guest, we'll have to keep following this closely and have you on again in the future.
And
sure.
if you like,
Thank you.
and we should add, if you like our show and you liked our amazing guest Danny, you should subscribe on Patreon because that's what keeps the show going.
Patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. So until then, we'll be back next week with another episode.